Happy Holy Hump Day on this June 15th, everyone. I'm Pastor Robert, and welcome to this midweek time where I can share some spiritual thoughts and reflections with you. This is the second part of a 2-week focus on the Gospel of Luke. And the reason I wanted to focus on the Gospel of Luke is because this is the gospel that is the appointed gospel for this year. There are 3 years as part of the cycle of readings. So for this year, it's the Gospel of Luke. And then for the other 2 years, it's the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Mark. And then the Gospel of John gets interspersed throughout the 3 years. And so, but the main gospel for this year is the Gospel of Luke. So if you come to church on a Sunday morning this year, chances are that the gospel reading will be from the Gospel of Luke. And last Sunday, I just shared some general thoughts about the Gospel of Luke, just to kind of help us know a little bit about the context of this gospel when we're hearing it read during worship. And I shared 5 interesting pieces of information about the Gospel of Luke when we started this last week. And the first thing that I mentioned was that Luke was most likely a Gentile who was writing to predominantly Gentile audience. Then the second thing that I mentioned was that Luke is writing to a particular person named Theophilus, and Theophilus could very well have been a real person that Luke was writing to, most likely a Roman governor or a Roman official. But Luke could have also have been using this as a literary device where he's writing to Theophilus, which literally means a lover of God. So Luke is presuming that we as listeners of his gospel, as hearers of his gospel, are also people who love God and want to love God even more by hearing about these stories of Jesus and the ministries of Jesus. And then the third interesting thing about the Gospel of Luke is that it's really a journey that Luke takes us on, where we're following Jesus all of the way to Jerusalem. And then the fourth thing that is very important to know about the Gospel of Luke is that even more than the other Gospels, Luke is emphasizing how Jesus reached out to those who are marginalized and those who were outcast. And then the fifth thing that I think is really important and a very creative thing that Luke does is Luke's gospel begins in the temple with Zechariah, who ends up being the father of John the Baptist. Zechariah has this vision in the temple since he was a priest, and that was how the gospel begins in the temple. And then the Gospel of Luke concludes with the ascension of Jesus, and the disciples are there. And then after Jesus ascends, the disciples go back to Jerusalem and they go to the temple and they continue in their worship and praise of God. So the Gospel of Luke begins in the temple and it concludes in the temple. So I thought it would be good for us to focus on a particular passage of Scripture from the Gospel of Luke for this week's Holy Hump Day focus. And I thought we would look at the Gospel reading for this upcoming Sunday from Luke chapter 8, verses 26 through 39. It's the story of where Jesus healed the demoniac. And this story, by the way, also shows up in the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Mark. And Luke tells this story with more details. And that's not unusual for Luke. Luke is known for details and all of that information in this account. And so you can read this story on your own. I thought I would just go ahead and share information about this story that you can reflect on. And it's, again, Luke chapter 8, verses 26 through 39. So let me first begin by sharing a little bit about the importance of the location of this story. It's where Jesus and the disciples are in Galilee, which is just east of the Sea of Galilee. And this was really largely a Gentile area. It wasn't Jewish. And Jesus was on foreign soil, so to speak. And so I think that's significant. Luke does like to show us how Jesus did go outside of the boundaries. And so this is an example of that. The other thing is that it's important is the scene that's happening here. So this very violent man approaches Jesus and the disciples. He has many spirits, many evil spirits, and this man is screaming. So you can imagine this. If you take in this scene in your imagination, how scary this must have been for the disciples when they saw this taking place. And what's interesting about this is just notice when you read this story how Jesus is remaining very calm. And it kind of reminds us of the story right before this one in the first part of chapter 8, where Jesus ends up calming the storm. And Jesus just remains peaceful during this very violent storm. And so another storm is kind of happening now with this demoniac approaching him and his disciples. So Jesus is true to form. He remains very calm in the midst of the storms that he faces. And this person that is the demoniac, he says that his name is Legion because there are many evil spirits in him. And the word legion is really a reference to a Roman legion, military legion, which would have consisted of between 4,000 to 6,000 men. And so that's how many spirits are at work in this man. He's definitely very, very tormented. And so no wonder why he approaches screaming and not in his right mind. So this is a very bizarre scene because there ends up in the story, Jesus heals this man by sending these evil spirits into some pigs, and Jesus ends up healing the man. And by the way, the presence of these pigs just reinforces that Jesus is in more foreign territory, Gentile territory, because you would not have pigs in any Jewish territory. So Jesus healing this man with these evil spirits is really a sign of God's saving grace and salvation at work through Jesus. So that's important to note. Not only is he healing this man, it's a sign of God's healing presence in the world and of God's kingdom that's coming upon the earth and launching through the person of Jesus. So Jesus' words to the healed man are very important because the man who is healed, he wants to become a follower of Jesus and go with Jesus, probably because he didn't really have anywhere to go, at least in his mind, because the people were scared about what had happened, what Jesus had done for this man. So this man thought, I'm just going to follow you, Jesus. But interestingly enough, Jesus wants him not to follow him, but to go back to his home and share with the others how God had saved him and healed him. And I just think that is really an interesting side note in this story. Sometimes Jesus wants people to follow him, and we find that throughout the Gospels. And you can find that actually in 2 Sundays from now, when I'm going to be preaching on Luke chapter 9, where Jesus really does want people to follow him. But in this situation, you'll see that in verse 39, Jesus says to this man, tell them what God has done for you. And what God has done, it's really what Jesus has done. So that's an interesting theological point here. If you want to tell people what God has done and who God is, just point them to Jesus and show them what Jesus has done, because Jesus is really the embodiment of God. So here are some thoughts about this particular story of Jesus healing the demoniac. And the first thing is that Jesus goes beyond the established boundaries in order to bring healing to this man. Again, remember, he's in foreign territory, so to speak. He's in Gentile land, and he is willing to do that. He's willing to go beyond the boundaries. And the second thing that I think this story points out is that Jesus' healing ministry is a sign that God's kingdom is at hand. And then the third thing of this story is that Jesus calls us to share our story of how God has brought healing in our lives and has saved us. And that's what Jesus was encouraging this man who had been healed by him to do. Go back to your home. Tell the people what God has done for you. And then the fourth thing is to know who God is, just look to Jesus. And I think that's just a very basic theological point to remember, that if you want to know what God is like, look to Jesus, and you'll find out what God is like. God is loving. God is kind. God is includes all people. God is willing to do whatever it takes to bring healing and wholeness to people. So that's a little bit about this upcoming Sunday's appointed gospel reading. And speaking of this Sunday, I invite you to join us for worship at either 9 o'clock in our chapel or 10:30 in our sanctuary, or you can watch the service live stream on our church's YouTube channel. The theme is going to be a quiet presence, and I'm going to focus on the Old Testament appointed scripture reading from 1 Kings and the story of the prophet Elijah. So join us for worship this Sunday, and may God's blessings be with you as we continue to reflect on the Gospel of Luke, and especially as we hear the Gospel of Luke read during the Sunday worship services, just to think about how if we want to know what God is like, just look at Jesus and see who Jesus is.